The U.S. is now addressing the UN. Let's listen in.
Stabilizing violence throughout our hemisphere. Nicolas Maduro and his co-defendant, Celia Flores, have been transferred here to the United States to stand trial for their crimes. Maduro was indicted by a grand jury in the Southern District of New York and faces very serious criminal charges for his involvement in a wide-ranging conspiracy to conduct narco-terrorism, to traffic cocaine and other drugs, and conducting international weapons trafficking. The overwhelming evidence of his crimes will be presented openly in U.S. court proceedings. Colleagues, Maduro is not just an indicted drug trafficker. He was an illegitimate so-called president. He was not a head of state. For years, Maduro and his cronies have manipulated Venezuela's electoral system to maintain their illegitimate grip on power. In fact, just 2 years ago in 2024, a UN panel of experts report found that the election in that year was absolutely and completely a farce and fell well short of the most basic transparency and integrity measures essential to upholding credible elections. If the UN and the United Nations in this body confers legitimacy on an illegitimate narco-terrorist and the same treatment in this charter of a democratically elected president or head of state, what kind of organization is this? We should note that over 50 countries, many nations, including the European Union, including a number of Latin American countries in the region, and of course the United States, again, over 50 countries rejected the legitimacy of Maduro's re-election following the disputed 2024 elections and do not recognize him as Venezuela's legitimately elected president. Maduro unlawfully refused to peacefully cede power after the Venezuelan people voted him out of office in the 2024 election. So therefore, Maduro was a fugitive from justice. He is the head of a vicious foreign terrorist organization, Cartel de los Soles. This regime-sponsored enterprise coordinates with and relies on other vicious criminal organizations, namely Tren de Aragua, again, among others, to carry out its objective of using illegal narcotics as a weapon against the United States. And for its part, Tren de Aragua is a designated foreign terrorist organization with thousands of members, many of whom have unlawfully infiltrated the United States and are conducting irregular warfare and undertaking hostile actions against the American people and against the United States. It's terrorizing criminals commit brutal crimes, including murders, kidnappings, extortions, and human, drug, and weapons trafficking. This administration, President Trump, will not stand for it. In fact, in March of 2025, President Trump declared that Tren de Aragua is quote, Tren de Aragua is undertaking hostile actions and conducting irregular warfare against the territory of the United States, both directly and at the direction, clandestine or otherwise, of the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Maduro and his cronies have partnered with some of the most violent and prolific drug traffickers and narco-terrorists in the world for decades, facilitating the flood of illegal drugs coming in the United States, estimated to be several hundred tons annually. He has become rich, incredibly wealthy, off the misery of untold numbers of Americans, Venezuelans, and others, aiding and abetting international terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, coordinating with corrupt Iranian officials, and other malign actors to influence not only the region, but to malignly influence the United States. In fact, in its own 2025 World Drug Report, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime identified Venezuela as a key trafficking route in the Western Hemisphere for illegal drugs, predominantly cocaine, entering the United States and increasingly Europe. As Secretary Rubio stated just yesterday, this is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live. And we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base of operation for our nation's adversaries and competitors and rivals of the United States. You can't turn Venezuela into the operating hub for Iran, for Hezbollah, for gangs, for Cuban intelligence agents, and other malign actors that control that country. You cannot continue to have the largest energy reserves in the world under the control of adversaries of the United States, under the control of illegitimate leaders, and not benefiting the people of Venezuela, and stolen by a handful of oligarchs inside of Venezuela. But it doesn't stop there. Numerous UN and international human rights organizations have issued reports documenting serious human rights abuses by the Maduro regime, including reports of extrajudicial killings, political prisoners, torture, and arbitrary and unlawful detentions. In fact, over 8 million Venezuelans have fled the country, destabilizing their neighbors in the region and creating the world's largest refugee crisis. Members of this council, colleagues, the United States wants a better future for Venezuela. We believe a better future for the people of Venezuela and for the people of the region and the world is stabilizing the region and making the neighborhood that we live in a much better and safer place. And this is why millions of Venezuelans that have fled this brutal regime are celebrating and cheering around the world as this body pontificates, including those celebrating are including in my home state of Florida, where hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans have fled this regime's brutality. I want to reiterate, President Trump gave diplomacy a chance. He offered Maduro multiple off-ramps. He tried to de-escalate. Maduro refused to take them. President Trump made it clear that the narco-terrorism must stop, and yet it continued. The United States will not waver in our actions to protect Americans from the scourge of narco-terrorism and seeks peace, liberty, and justice for the great people of Venezuela. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States and now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We'd like to extend a warm welcome to the representatives of Bahrain.
We've just been watching an emergency UN Security Council meeting in New York City after the ouster of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Mike Waltz, is making the case there that the operation for the U.S. to capture Maduro was legal, and it makes the people of Venezuela and the U.S. safer. Let's bring in senior national policy reporter Ann Flaherty for more, and White House correspondent Karen Travers. And Waltz is making the case here that this was an illegitimate government. He was not a democratically elected president. And not only was he involved in this drug trafficking, but that also had ties to terror. How critical is that link, and how are they making it?
Well, it's certainly critical to the drug charges that Maduro is facing, but there's a lot of shock in that room from world leaders who've expressed dismay that the U.S. would go into a foreign country and essentially capture the leader of that country. Now, to be clear, Maduro does not have a lot of friends. He is clearly, somebody who has been accused of stealing the election, of somebody who has taken over control of the country through a dictatorship and through brute force. His predecessor, Hugo Chavez, obviously paving the way for that. He doesn't have a lot of friends in that room, but a lot of those world leaders are clearly very disturbed by the idea that the United States would go in and decide that its laws apply to this foreign leader. And of course, leaving that kind of power vacuum there. So, Mike Waltz making the case that, look, this is about narco-terrorism. He's caused a lot of problems in the region. And we've given him off-ramps, he said. We gave him many diplomatic off-ramps. But Maduro choosing not to take it, and he risked those consequences. So now what we're going to be watching is the reaction from countries like China and Russia. China very dependent upon the oil in Venezuela, Russia having close ties to that. This could, risk stoking tensions with other countries that the United States would rather, have some kind of a warm relationship with. It's going to cause issues down the road with that.
And Karen, now there are questions are growing about what's next for Venezuela. The president said over the weekend that we are in charge, that the U.S. will run Venezuela, at least for now. Secretary Rubio seemed to kind of soften that a little bit. So what's the latest from the White House on what happens next?
Yeah, and still not a lot of answers on the specifics beyond what we heard yesterday from the Secretary of State. And I think it is notable to hear from Secretary Rubio and there with Ambassador Waltz that diplomatic speak, certainly trying to soften some of the president's language over the weekend. But then the president last night, Diane, speaking to reporters on Air Force One, going back to that very blunt message. The president told reporters, don't ask me who's in charge in Venezuela, because I'll give you an answer and it'll be very controversial. And reporters said, what does that mean? And the president again, Diane, said, it means we're in charge. So you have the Secretary of State yesterday indicating that when the president says that, it just means that the United States is going to be putting pressure on Venezuela and that the United States has leverage. But the president last night saying, no, I meant what I said and we're in charge. He was also asked about conversations he might have with the interim leader there, the vice president, now the acting leader in Venezuela. He says he has not spoken to her, but that he will at the appropriate time. He also issued somewhat of a threat to Delcy Rodriguez, saying that she could face a situation worse than Maduro because, as the president put it, Maduro gave up immediately.
All right, Ann Flaherty, Karen Travers, thank you both.